Welcome to Power to the Player, where we discuss different ways to level the playing field and allow athletes' voices to be heard. My name is Isaac Chapman, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Steven Rizzo.
It's a pleasure to be here, Isaac. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Steven is a student at Boston University who now watches and discusses sports after playing himself in high school. Would you mind telling me a bit about your experience in high school sports?
Of course. Growing up, I always knew I'd either be playing basketball or football. Come high school, I found my place in football. Although the 6 a.m. lifting followed by the 5 p.m. practices weren't my favorite, there was something inside me that kept pushing me to play.
Did you play more for fun, or were you working to move on with it in college?
I don't think I enjoyed my time in it enough to push myself to work towards college, but so many of my teammates felt the opposite.
Could you expand on that a bit more?
Definitely. There were some kids on my team who lived and breathed football. During class, they would all discuss with myself and each other this past week's practices or highlights from a recent game. They dedicated every second they could to working out, running drills, and studying formations. If I were putting in 100% every day, they were putting in 150.
It's interesting to hear that even at high school level, there are kids who are as serious about their sport as, say, a college player.
I couldn't agree more. The tragedy in all of it is that there aren't many people who have the ability to help them who take it as seriously as they do.
I would imagine that the school authorities have the players' best interest in mind, right?
To an extent, yes. But a big area in which high school sports fall short is taking into account what players have to say. There are so many factors that go into a student being able to move on to college through a high school sport. You have to look at how much time the student spends practicing, how much time that takes away from student study hours, and things like that. You have to keep in mind that grades and test scores are a big part of a college recruitment. If an athlete cannot keep their grades up, they cannot participate in sports, and it negatively affects their recruiting profile.
You're making a lot of great points. What I'm gathering is that school authorities need to keep in mind the academic limitations that athletics puts on hardworking athletes.
Exactly. For some of these guys, college scholarships are one of the few choices that they have for a life with a degree. For the unfortunate part of the crowd that doesn't have a way of paying for college financially, going in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt is the only way to get a degree, if at all.
This whole conversation opens up a massive can of worms, said worms being how authorities treat the athlete on a college and even professional level.
How so?
I mean, look at players' unions in the NBA and NFL, for example. Organizations like these are some of the only establishments keeping owners and investors from treating professional athletes as pawn in their respective sports.
Well, I don't think they can be compared too sharply. In recent years, the voices of the players in the NBA have become much more valuable, especially in trade talks and social issues.
I do agree with that, but that doesn't mean players' opinions is part of the discussion when it comes to making policy that directly affects them. The first thing that comes to mind thinking of this is the trade talks between the Lakers and Pelicans for Anthony Davis. Davis told the front office and made it clear to the organization that he had no desire to be there anymore. But in the grand scheme of the situation, the Pelicans never even intended to trade him. It was all in efforts to take a stab at the Lakers organization for encouraging public trade talks around Davis. Because of this whole situation, Davis missed valuable time to better himself in the prime of his career and sat on the bench for the remainder of the season. Players shouldn't have to miss time because they're unhappy with their current situation, especially for a player like Davis, who gave it his all for the Pelicans organization for years.
The Anthony Davis situation is certainly a talking point about the power of players. It could be used as a point for either side. The NFL could look at the situation and say that Anthony Davis caused two franchises to basically lose their season. Too much player involvement causes chaos in the league. And because of that chaos, the NFL prefers not to let players have that much power. You ever hear of a player causing that much disruption in the NFL?
Well, yes.
Really?
Yeah, just this last year, Le'Veon Bell expressed his desire to be paid more by the Pittsburgh Steelers. The team used their franchise tag on him for the second year in a row, and because of that, he would not get paid as much. Relations between him, his teammates, and the Steelers all fell apart, and he wouldn't play the whole season. It seems like whenever players try to get more power for themselves, that it never ends up good for anyone. Anthony Davis destroyed 2 team seasons, and Le'Veon Bell crippled the Steelers season.
Yes, but they are both important for the players gaining power and creating their own destinies. While Le'Veon Bell, in my opinion, didn't go about the whole situation very well, he did make precedents for NFL players who are unhappy with their situations. As we said before, NFL players have much less power than their NBA counterparts.
But where did this power gap come from? Why do NBA players have so much more power in league decisions than their NFL counterparts?
The NBA Players Association is much more powerful than the NFL union. The NFL has had many lockouts that have resulted in nothing being gained for the players. The 1987 NFL lockout comes to mind here. Players wanted better rights and more say in league governance, but eventually were run down and got nothing as backlash came.
Backlash?
Yeah, the NFL decided that while the strike was going on, they still needed to play football, and they hired a bunch of inferior players who, under normal circumstances, would have never played in the NFL at all. It was just a terrible product, and eventually, fans started to become restless, and they started to turn on the striking players.
Team power and player power is really a balancing act, isn't it? Give too much power to the players, and the league can become uncompetitive. But give too much power to the team owners and the league, and players will basically have no rights. It's a hard balance to find between the two. And there's the fans you have to think about as well.
Meanwhile, in the NBA, players have grabbed power for themselves. The NBA players didn't care about backlash and fought for their rights. Oscar Robertson, Hall of Famer and former president of the NBA Players Association, comes to mind. He sued the NBA rather than strike, and his lawsuit resulted in the creation of free agency as we know it today for NBA players. Ever since then, the NBA players have had a strong influence on the league.
So, what does player power actually get the athletes? We've talked about free agency rights and a right to control their destiny, a la Anthony Davis and Le'Veon Bell. But what else?
Well, there's a correlation between player power and welfare. In a study from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, in leagues where players have more power, there is more social welfare received. They looked at competitive balance and how that influenced player welfare. So in a league like the NBA, where players definitely have a strong voice in the league decisions, they will receive more welfare but lose competitive parity. For the NFL, a league that enforces parity and where players have less of a voice in governing of their league, they receive less welfare from the league.
Now that's interesting. From what I get here, it seems like everyone would have to sacrifice something in order to get what they want. It's not just a balancing act between the teams, players, and leagues. There seems to be a fan component too. You talked about the parity, right?
Yes, obviously meeting the needs of the players is important. But while talking about whether or not players should have power in league decisions, we shouldn't forget about how sports is a business, and in the end, sometimes money just takes precedence over other issues.
Really is tough to find that balance. You want players to be happy, but you want to keep the league in order. And of course, the fan aspect too. You want an appealing product for fans to enjoy. It's interesting to see the different approaches to this by different leagues. We're going to go to a commercial break and we'll talk about this more when we come back. Whenever I feel like a sweaty slob, there's one assurance that gives me peace of mind. Deodorant. Just one wipe under each armpit and I am good to go for days. Heck, I don't even need to shower for one whole week. That's how good this shiz is. Another topic I'd like to address as far as taking fairness in high school athletics seriously is who should be able to participate in athletic categories. This discussion touches both in high school sports and Olympic level competition.
Are you referring to transgender athletes?
They are a part of the whole, but the big picture is more centered around policy that makes competition fair for all gender identities. The policy I'm referring to is implementing rules that regulate competition based on biological factors such as birth sex and testosterone levels rather than gender identity. And this is just a bigger part of the whole for fairness in high school sports and taking it more seriously.
I've actually heard about these issues involving this in high school sports.
You're correct. There are actually two major cases that have happened in recent years that address many of the factors that go into this argument. The first situation involves this transgender man, Mack Beggs, who is a state champion high school wrestler in Texas. He began his transition from female to male a couple of years ago, which includes taking testosterone injections through a needle. Naturally, one would think that if he's transitioning to being a male, he'd compete in the boys category. The University Interscholastic League, which is the high school regulation in Texas, however, are strict in that athletes are required to compete in the category that corresponds to their birth sex.
I don't see the problem here. Max still exists in a biologically female frame, so what's the problem with competing in the girls category?
The problem is that testosterone, which Beggs takes injections of as part of the transition process, naturally increases muscle mass. It's why men are not so much stronger, but men have a natural tendency to have more muscle mass than women. According to the National Library of Medicine, male test subjects injected with testosterone showed a 20% mean increase in muscle mass over a 12-week period. Keeping this in mind, it is no surprise that Beggs suddenly began dominating the female category after he began injections. And don't get me wrong, I have no accusations towards Beggs for his success in wrestling. He's definitely an amazing wrestler. My frustration is towards the UIL, who could easily implement policy that would allow Beggs to compete in the male category, which he prefers to do.
Based off of what you said, how does this exactly fit into the argument that sports need to be divided based on biological factors rather than simple binary?
I think the point is clear. If a transgender athlete is taking injections that are scientifically proven to boost muscle mass in a category where others aren't, there's a clear discrepancy. We have to bring to light the fact that the spirit of athletics can be ruined if rules and fairness are overshadowed in the name of inclusion.
Let me kick you a situation then. Let's say a transgender woman is looking to compete in a girls' soccer at her high school. She takes testosterone blockers as a part of the transition process. Would it be fair to allow her to play? And if not, would there ever be a time in the future when she could?
Now we're getting into a testy area of the matter. I've thought on this a lot, and honestly, it's hard to come up with a concise answer without being unethical to one party. On one hand, the transgender girl still has a lot of natural muscle mass that comes from the heightened testosterone levels in biological men. That in and of itself is already a biological advantage. However, the testosterone blockers are sure to cause at least some atrophy in the muscle, which is degradation of the muscle because there's not enough testosterone until they reach a level that matches how much testosterone is present. Keeping that in mind, there must be a time when the muscle mass of the transgender female would reach a level that matches that of her teammates.
Well, I do agree. Is this really all necessary for something as basic as high school athletics?
Absolutely. This ties right back to the beginning when we were talking about how important high school athletics can be to the everyday lives and future of so many of the students that participate. We have to set up structure at the very lowest level in order to create an organized and efficient route to college and professional careers.
I don't think that ostracizing trans athletes is a correct approach to take on this matter. Some of them probably aren't even looking to further their careers in sports. Some, like me, are probably just looking for a place to belong and a group to identify with.
By all means, yes, I agree. But we need to be serious about how we're treating competition in high school sports. So many kids rely on this to get to college, and moreover, so many kids rely on it as a pastime after school. If we're to dilute the competition in the name of inclusion, the merit that brings kids to college for this stuff will be lost. But let's take the second case, for example. Andrea Yearwood, a trans woman athlete at Cromwell High School in Connecticut, has hit headlines recently for winning gold in girls' track and field events her freshman and sophomore year.
Is she taking testosterone blockers, or is at least working to begin the transition process?
See, that's the kicker. Yearwood has taken no steps towards transitioning, besides outright saying that she identifies as female. As of right now, Yearwood is in a male frame competing against female ones. There's a clear biological advantage, and the reason Yearwood is able to get away with this is because, unlike the UIL, Connecticut athletic rules allow athletes to compete in whichever binary they identify with.
I see your point, that trans athletes competing need to be regulated based on where they are in the transition process, and from which binary they are transitioning from.
Exactly. Believe me, I am all for trans athletes competing in their fields and being successful, but a line has to be drawn to designate what is fair and unfair as long as competing goes.
Let's tie this all back to our original argument, because I feel we just went off on a huge tangent. So what we have here is high school sports and the policies surrounding them that need to be taken more seriously.
Exactly. And that starts with us. High school athletes have no voice, so we need to be theirs. That's about all the time we have. Thank you, Stephen, for joining me.
My pleasure.